Hey, welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. I'm your host, Rick Giannotta, and really happy to have a phenomenal guest to speak all things policy and politics. Andrew Barnhill is a nationally recognized, award-winning life sciences government affairs exec. He's a lobbyist on the Hill. He was named the Hill's top lobbyist for 2022 in the corporate category and one of the 50 best lobbyists in Washington, D.C. He's currently head of policy and chief of government affairs at IQVIA, the world's largest clinical research company. He previously served as director of federal policy for GlaxoSmithKline. And from the political side, he was also a 2016 Democratic nominee for North Carolina State Senate. So has a lot of perspectives there that I think are going to be a real value add for the audience. So with that, so happy to have Andrew Barnhill on the show. So happy to have friend and colleague Andrew Barnhill on the podcast today to discuss one of what I think are the most important issues, certainly up for grabs up until the election in 2024, and that is all things politics and policy. So Andrew, welcome. So happy to have you on the Healthcare Nation podcast.
Well, thank you, Rick. I really appreciate you inviting me and glad to join you and talk all things healthcare policy and legislation today.
Love it, love it, love it. And full disclosure, Andrew and I also teach together, which is fantastic at NYU. So we have a long, I think, commitment to academics and seeing the next generation really step up and make the changes which we think are going to be necessary. And as we said, in the policy realm, certainly, but a lot more than that. So again, Andrew, welcome. And let's just jump right in. I wanted to kind of level set by letting the audience know what you've been up to lately and tell us what have you been working on and what's important in the field of, dare I say, lobbying and what you're doing out on the Hill?
Sure. Well, thank you, Rick. So in addition to teaching, which I consider a great priority in my life, I love working with students who are interested in healthcare management and healthcare policy. My primary hat, if you will, is leading public policy and government affairs for IQVIA, the world's largest clinical research and healthcare technology company. So that essentially means that I represent the organization before government, and that's both state, local, and federal government, with an eye towards how can we keep the patient's interest in mind and at heart and at center in everything that we do on the legislative side and the regulatory side. So I've spent a lot of my career on Capitol Hill. I live here in Washington, D.C., and I do everything from talking with government staff and elected officials to finding out ways that we can communicate the stories of healthcare policy and clinical research to a diverse array of audiences. But I've spent a career doing that at several different companies and am really committed to sort of building a narrative around the clinical research infrastructure.
Fantastic. There's so much that is out there for me to pick and choose when I thought about pulling together information and questions for this podcast. But I thought, let's just start with some of the top of mind issues. One would be, on the other side of COVID, which would be the end of public health emergency funding. So give me your insights on that, where Congress is at. I know things are ending in May, but maybe the ramifications and reverberations across the country.
Right. So you highlighted it. The public health emergency, which has been extended several times, is actually ending on May 11th. And there are some things that will be changing with that end. So the way that Americans get access to COVID-19 testing will change, for instance, some of the current access to the free, over-the-counter test as part of that. There will be particularly some changes to some of the broader Medicare and Medicaid waivers and some of the expansive flexibilities for providers that have taken place through the emergency will actually end. But a lot of things are going to stay in place. So some of the provisions regarding, access to telehealth are going to be extended even beyond this. The process for states to begin redetermining eligibility for Medicaid, not affected by this. Access to some specific treatments that were expanded during the public health emergency will not change. So I think what we saw, and this is true for Congress and for the Biden administration, is that while there might be some broad flexibilities for the government payers, i.e., Medicare and Medicaid, that need to sort of subside here at this juncture. Some of the commitments to transformation of care surrounding telehealth and easing of access nationwide are actually going to be in place for the long term. So I think if you're a provider or a patient who's looking at the news and saying, oh, the public health emergency is ending in May, you can rest assured that some of the things that you've gotten used to about accessing care more readily from home, perhaps, are going to be extended.
Yeah, the telehealth piece is something that has intrigued me for so many different reasons, but the opportunity to increase access to care is clearly one of the benefits of it. And also just it's a model that I think with staff shortages, with leveraging technology, it's certainly something that has matured to the point with, I think, not only the technology, but even our reimbursement where its time has come. Along those lines, I think a lot of the PHE we're seeing as it ends, these are going to be going down separate tracks, right? Telehealth, when we look at legislation, laws, et cetera. How does regulation play into that? And what do you see on the lobbying scene with respect to telehealth?
Sure. Well, we certainly saw a growth among the telehealth providers as organizations that developed and enhanced their capabilities, during COVID. But there's also your traditional healthcare providers, your traditional research entities that touch patients directly, have all certainly been advocating for the rules, so those regulations that actually come from CMS and HHS to reflect the access that Americans have gotten used to during COVID-19. So particularly think about some of the Medicare flexibilities for those who live in rural areas that may struggle to find access to care. They've come to rely on being able to easily get access via telehealth. It's expanding their prescriptions. Make it another supply for a lengthier period of time through telehealth without having to go in to see your provider. That's going to continue, but that's also thanks to the lobbying that's taken place both by your payers and your telehealth companies that have really grown during the pandemic.
What do we see in the clinical research space as it relates to telehealth? Is there lots of movement there?
Well, in the clinical research space, relative to the public health emergency, we're certainly seeing a commitment to making use of the emergency use authorization process with the FDA and other regulators around the world. We've gotten used to a new way of working with the regulators that is much faster in the past. And I think that's continuing, beyond the ending of the public health emergency. We're seeing these regulators, starting with the FDA, of course, learn to adapt to a new environment. And I don't think any clinical research organization wants the regulators to go back.
Yeah. Let me get back to the Medicaid expansion question. And I know certainly in these political times, there's no lack of, opportunity for either party to weigh in. But right now, I think, at least what I'm reading, Republicans are looking for ways to reduce federal spending. Clearly, Medicare, one of the areas that are in the bullseye, I would say, as well as Medicaid. Sure. What are your thoughts on that as things kind of head towards certainly 2024 and where the House and Senate is right now?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Let's take Medicaid expansion. That was certainly and continues to be a hot button polarizing issue at the state level. However, recently with South Dakota becoming the 40th state to expand Medicaid, we've seen even some very red Republican states agree that it makes sense. In North Carolina right now. Right. Go ahead.
No, I saw that in North Carolina as well, right? Something that was in there with a lot of other, I think, I won't say bills, but provisions tied to it, but it seems like it got the green light.
Yeah, what's moving along, there's a little bit of a negotiation in the House right now after the Senate bought onto it. But I think what you're seeing in these cases, particularly some of the later expansion states that we saw over the past couple of years, that with more federal dollars kicking in, and so with that threshold of 90% federal dollars for Medicaid, 10% coming from the state, it makes obvious sense to even Republican states that are very concerned about their state budget, right? And so we saw a real sharp adjustment in the language surrounding Medicaid over just 2 election cycles that we might not have anticipated if you were to go back to 2016. I remember being in the heart of the very contentious 2016 election cycle down in North Carolina. It was a major debate, and you never would have seen so many Republican statewide leaders arguing for Medicaid expansion, and now we have. So I think that's to say that it's almost becoming a settled issue, but we still have a few more states to go this cycle.
Yeah, this may be off topic, but how about your thoughts on Medicare Advantage and managed Medicaid as we look to the future, and I guess ways to reduce or manage the cost of care in certainly those 2 areas and those 2 populations?
Yeah. I mean, I think it certainly can become a way to think about reducing costs, particularly if the model of funding in both the federal Medicare space and the largely state-controlled Medicaid space becomes unsustainable as a formula for funding. So there may be scenarios down the road where states and CMS at the federal level recognize we've got to open the doors for more partnerships with the private sector. And of course, that's where Medicare Advantage comes in. I don't know if we're necessarily there yet as far as seeing a major change in the current model that we have, but those programs have grown. And I think you've seen by when you ask patients, most of the surveys done about Medicare Advantage, there's an appetite for that model to expand. So I think we could see it, but time will tell.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what's happening in the consumer, almost retail space. We saw Amazon and One Medical, the deal went through there. There's
Sure.
a lot more happening. Certainly every time, you go online, there's another opportunity, yep. but it does seem that it's polarizing, right? It's separating.
Well, in some ways, there are a lot of good things happening that can expand access to care. I mean, you don't want to see policies put in place that make it difficult for these new models to develop if they are ultimately going to be the types of things that increase access. However, one of the things that we found, for instance, in the clinical trial space is that you have some healthcare companies that may not be expert in a new area. For instance, some of the traditional retailers like Walgreens and CVS trying to go into the clinical trial space. That sort of disruption may cause more harm down the road if they don't develop the capabilities to actually work alongside your traditional CROs. Having said that, I think some of the growth of programs like what you see with One Medical, expanding the ability of a patient to access more concierge type care or care as you go, that's the type of thing that can really both expand access and give patients more to choose from.
Yeah, I think it's such an exciting time. And, you mentioned not necessarily that it would be a challenge, but let's call it the opportunity when you look at, say, the expansion of clinical trials with Walgreens or a CVS or the kind of population access that they would have. To me, it seems like there'd be nothing but upside, except for the fact that you've got to check the box on the regulatory side, on obviously everything we do with the clinical trials approach that makes sure the integrity is intact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one of the things that we have to look at with access to clinical trials is, what are the actual barriers that are preventing patients from participating in trials? We talk about expanding access, we talk about expanding equity, but often we talk sort of around the margins, and we don't necessarily look at what makes it difficult for a patient to learn about a trial, perhaps. And one of the things that I've discovered through some of my advocacy work is that it's often about, getting physicians to talk to their patients about the presence of clinical trials. If you are a physician associated with an academic medical center, it's far more likely that you know about what's out there. If you are tied, perhaps to a community clinic or a community medical center, you might not have access to as much information as a provider. So one of the things that we're looking to do in my role with IQVIA is trying to incentivize physicians to learn about and speak to their patients about clinical trials.
Yeah, it's definitely an opportunity, and I keep getting back to how we've got this exponential snowball effect with technology that we need to really take advantage of. And certainly in the clinical trial space, I think there's nothing but upsides. But getting the word out and having the access there, that's such a key component. Let me pivot a bit and stay on the technology side, but also I think touch upon areas with respect to policy that are really, as I say, far too often loaded propositions. And that would be artificial intelligence, data privacy, what's happening with ChatGPT. There's a lot of policy talk around that. It's early days. And I think whenever things are, newly emerging, there's not a lot of regulation, and there's probably a little bit of, amorphous, let's put it this way, focus with respect to policy. What are your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to the challenges with data privacy. One of the things that you may be seeing, and not everyone in healthcare follows this, I certainly have had to, over recent years, because the state legislative landscape has changed, you're now seeing a patchwork of states proposing data privacy bills that touch on healthcare data. I think there is this certain feeling by consumers out there that, we share our data with so many different sources. We would like to have a better handle on how that data is being shared. But one of the things to also keep in mind is that many of the great advances in technology that you mentioned related to health IT succeed because we can access such a wide range of data, everything from consumer data to clinical trial data to other forms of healthcare data out there. And so we have to develop privacy frameworks that actually make sense for protecting the patient and or the consumer, as well as for healthcare organizations. And we found states trying to do this, but with the absence of some sort of federal standard on data privacy that actually works, it's going to be an ongoing challenge. So I think we're getting ready to hit an inflection point in discussions around data and the sort of interplay with emerging healthcare technologies. And it's going to require some type of federal action. The challenge is making sure to get that right so that we are protecting both the patient and, preventing barriers from coming into place for those new technologies.
Yeah, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what our definition is now of that data that we would acquire, right? Actively acquire, passively acquire. Is it what we think of maybe historically, clinically as, clinical, physiologic, parametric data? Or is it now getting into the world of, consumer preferences and even through technology, where someone might be shopping or eating, et cetera, which I would think could have a lot of value for a pharma company that's developing a new drug, et cetera. What do we do in that space from a policy perspective?
Sure. So there's a traditional healthcare data and traditional clinical data. There's also what we would consider real world data, which is that information about a patient that does not come directly from clinical observations that also helps us make sense of who this patient is. And there is emerging interest in real world data and real world evidence, so much so the FDA has begun issuing guidance about how to make use of such data in their approval process for new drugs. And so, most pharmaceutical manufacturers and clinical research organizations out there are beginning, if they haven't already for many years, to make use of real world data in an accelerated way. I think the challenge is, as the receptivity to this grows by regulators such as FDA, we have to get it right. We have to figure out how the guidance and the process of including such data in your approval processes for new drugs and your regulation of healthcare products can protect both the patient and the companies themselves. So I think we're still in early stages there in the United States. Europe's a little bit further ahead. But if you're asking, hey, what do we expect in the next 5 years in the clinical research landscape, I would say watch the growth of real world data for some of the interesting things that it can provide.
Yeah. And do we make a jump also from patient reported data to consumer reported data? Is there such a notion out there when you think about clinical research or the applicability of that data set to a drug development or a med device development?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think consumer data certainly has its place in the clinical research infrastructure and in healthcare more broadly. I think there are certainly some companies that do that well. There are others that have to, really begin to think about the standards that they put in place to make use of these other forms of data. And I think that time will tell how that becomes regulated and how that fits into the conversation about data privacy legislation. Remember, one of the things to keep in mind is that healthcare is sort of started out as tangential to the data privacy debate. These discussions were really started to try to regulate the large tech companies, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world out there. And healthcare kind of became this sort of like sideline conversation. Now, I think those of us that are involved in the space are starting to say, while you may be targeting large technology companies, you also have to think about what these proposed legislation and regulation actually means for those that are involved in the delivery of care.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that, Andrew. Let me pivot back now to what I would say more on the, top of mind, new and noteworthy, politically charged area. One of those, I think, would be drug pricing and what's happening there. Certainly with the Inflation Reduction Act that's out there, the provisions that are in that, capping out-of-pocket spending for Medicare beneficiaries, what we're seeing with the insulin capping that's out there also for Medicare, a lot going on in the space, certainly top of mind for not only, I would say, the folks involved in the political process because it's a hot button, but for individuals who have been paying such, high amounts out of pocket or associated premiums. Your thoughts on that space, Andrew?
Yeah. So drug pricing has always been a particular challenge because, a lot of times federal legislators, Congress, of course, try to present it as an easy problem to fix. So they think about drug pricing all in sort of one lane. But often it's a much more complicated landscape. You have low-cost generics that, are how people get treatment for most of their daily chronic conditions, if you will, the maintenance medications that, vast sums of Americans take day to day. And then you have a small group of specialty drugs that are particularly high cost. And those are the ones that get a lot of attention. But often the solutions that are proposed try to treat drug pricing with sort of a broad brush. And that's been one of the challenges through time. The Inflation Reduction Act that passed and ostensibly put some of these drug pricing changes into place was not without controversy. Most of us in the life sciences found it to be, a particularly challenging proposal. But of course, time will tell how much it can actually help patients. One of the biggest things that we're going to see happening is actually the changing around of the Part D benefit in Medicare as far as who pays what. So you're going to see a little bit more of a burden on the payers and the manufacturers than you are on the government, on CMS itself. How does that trickle down to the patients? Are patients going to end up actually paying more, or are they going to pay less at the counter? That's something we're going to have to watch over the next 3 to 5 years. The other big thing that we are seeing is the drug price negotiation process. So this is a new mechanism that's being put into place by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to take a series of drugs, starting with Part D and then going into Part B drugs, and ostensibly set the cost of what those drugs should be. Now, a lot of manufacturers are concerned that this is really going to shake up the process of pricing drugs in a variety of therapeutic areas, because when you set the price of one, you're also really setting the price of all the others in that particular class. This hasn't started yet. CMS is in its process of, developing the mechanisms to make this happen. It could prove to lower the cost of some drugs for patients. It could prove to end up raising the cost by some premiums having to go up. We don't exactly know how that's going to work because this is a new model that's being put into place. But it is one of the first real examples of disruption in the American pricing landscape that we've seen in a long time. The other, of course, change that we're starting to see is the price of insulin. We just saw Lilly make a commitment there. We will likely see some others making commitments down the road. So, in some ways, pieces of legislation like the IRA can develop mechanisms that put new rules and procedures in place. And in other ways, they can motivate individual private sector actors to do things that can then shape the landscape indirectly. So we will likely see a lot of change in the drug pricing landscape over the next couple of years, but how that actually benefits the patient, I think time will tell.
Yeah, and I think how it benefits the patient, whether it be access to new and novel therapeutics, fantastic. If it is lower cost for drugs like insulin, et cetera, fantastic. Will there be a counterpoint to this where it starts to blunt innovation because there's not money to be made by pharma? I think, and I'm using pharma obviously as the example here. That's another concern.
Well, and that's one of our really large concerns. What does this look like 5 and 10 years down the road? Are individual manufacturers going to decide, hey, this particular pipeline we have in the oncology space, well, it doesn't make sense for us to keep investing here if we're not going to be able to recoup the cost. So does that mean that multiple new oncology therapeutics are sort of left on the table? Very likely. Does it also mean that, the portfolios of products themselves that individual manufacturers develop and decide on are shaped by this particular policy? That's also pretty likely. And for those that conduct clinical trials, it's a concern that, the pipeline of products to conduct trials in is going to significantly decrease over time. So to the extent that this becomes an issue in the immediate term, we have to watch what CMS does, maybe over the next year. But the concerns about innovation are real. They are not just hyperbole from the industry, and it's something we have to pay attention to.
I've said all too often that the innovation that's happening, and perhaps I say this unfairly, really comes out of the private sector, certainly in the health sector. It seems that way. And when I think about this example and pharma, is there an equal concern in the med device, biospace?
Mm-hmm. I think there is certainly concern. I think the focus right now is on those manufacturers who are in the Part B, Medicare Part B and Part D. So your drugs and your infusions are certainly the areas of focus because that's where CMS and the legislation actually placed its focus. But one of the things that we see with pieces of legislation like this is once you have a model to do something, it can be expanded relatively easily. So I think the device companies are certainly paying close attention.
Yeah, I think medtech, biotech, pharma, there's just an area where there's an overlap with new technology, molecules, everything that's happening in the science side that really starts to beg the question of, it's not just these discrete borders between pharma and say, medtech.
That's right. That's right.
So let me ask you one specific question about the growing population of folks over 65 and the impact of that population as we move forward, certainly with Medicare, and how that influences policy and also voting along those lines. I'd just love to get your thoughts on that, having been in the political world and now as a lobbyist.
Right. I think it certainly focuses the attention on prescription drugs and healthcare costs as a whole. When you talk to individual constituents, when I worked in a congressional office, I did this frequently. You'll hear about how the cost of care is so high, but to those individuals, they often don't separate the cost between a hospital visit for a procedure and the cost of what they're paying for drugs and the cost of going to their doctor. They just think about healthcare costs as a whole. So to the extent that policies can help think about healthcare costs both individually, as far as the different parts of the ecosystem, and as a whole for people over the age of 65, I think is important because it's something that, certainly drives everyday conversations of people all across the country. I think it's easy to make a villain out of individual industries at a time, whether it's, pharmaceutical manufacturers one year or hospitals the next. But I think we have to be reflective about, how can we develop practices that promote access to care earlier so that we are not offloading all of those high costs onto the last few years of life where the costs are just extraordinary, both for the federal government and for the patient.
Yeah, great points. Absolutely. And I think that when we look at the over 65 population, the influence on voting and the point you made with what would be top of mind for that constituency, it just makes sense. It really does. Let me ask you, mental health, obviously out there, it's been top of mind for so many folks. It is in the headlines when we think about cities that are struggling with folks who are really, challenged with everything from housing to access to care, et cetera. What are your thoughts on what's happening at the Hill with respect to mental health and approaching that?
Yeah. Well, mental health reform certainly has some champions on Capitol Hill now. I think for the first time, you're starting to see members of Congress be very vocal about their own mental health. We've seen that with some members of the Senate most recently. So I think there is an interest to see significant reforms. In fact, when I go in and talk to members of Congress, even though I don't work in the mental health space, it's one of the things that still comes up frequently. And they ask about my experiences with my students, for instance. So I think there's an awareness in a way that we haven't seen in prior Congresses. Whether a significant piece of mental health legislation passes in the next couple of years, I still think the odds of that are pretty slim, just because of the uphill battle that it takes to have a major piece of legislation move. But I think that the awareness is there and the energy in a bipartisan way is there for maybe the first time in a while.
That's good to hear. Same question, but focused more on the equity side, health equity. Is there enough awareness with, let's say, the social determinants of health, proposals, initiatives that are out there? I know at the state level there's a lot of activity, but wondering what's happening and what you're hearing on the Hill.
Yes, I think there certainly is a growing interest there. One of the key pieces of healthcare legislation that we've had in the past decade was the 21st Century Cures Act, and we've actually had discussions about having a second iteration of that would focus a lot on diversity of clinical trials, reforms in the health equity space. That certainly, didn't cross the finish line this past Congress, but I think there's a lot of energy surrounding those issues now. We did see a couple of small pieces of legislation and commitments to diverse clinical research that made its way into the omnibus bill at the end of last year. We've certainly seen some members of Congress in both parties start talking about social determinants of health broadly. So it's certainly in the conversation, and it's certainly, I think members are more educated on, issues related to health equity than they have been in the past, similar to the issues surrounding mental health. But getting a sizable piece of legislation, focused on health equity across the finish line, that still seems to be a pretty tall order.
And I think what I'm hearing here, Andrew, is that it's safe to say that both parties are equally engaged in this topic. Is that accurate?
I think equally engaged in different ways. And so, take the diverse clinical trials issue for one. I think you saw many Democrats want to develop a model that's focused on sort of a quota system or a mandate system for clinical trial providers, and many Republicans want to see a model that's based on incentive structures. So you see a similar focus, but a different approach by both parties.
Yeah, I guess maybe thematically to connect the dots to the FDA and even the CDC, when you think about the changes, obviously, in the House and Senate and recent hearings that have been happening. What is the future of the CDC, or even a little stretch in, let's say, the FDA, or what they'll be focused on?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I would say that most Americans didn't pay that much attention to the CDC, prior to COVID. And now, everyone seems to have opinions about the CDC. But the agency's been through quite a bit. It's received a significant amount of funding over recent years, but Director Walensky has admitted that it needs to undergo some significant reforms in its operations to meet the demands of current times. I think we saw that its ability to quickly access data from the state and local levels was particularly challenging without private sector support. So I think we're seeing sort of a road for potential changes. One of the things that CDC has done with its new sources of funding during COVID is to begin to stand up a new disease forecasting center, which is the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, that's designed to sort of bring together next generation public health data capabilities, some disease modeling, some high quality surveillance techniques to really be able to identify future pandemics before they take root. And so that's the type of thing that, I think gives rise to some optimism and hope for the future of CDC. They've just received the funding for it this past year, so time will tell how it develops. But that's an example of the agency attempting to adapt for a new era.
Yeah. I think a lot of changes out there, a lot of questions about, obviously I've said it time and time again, source of truth, facts, et cetera, the retrospectively unpacking approaches, the pandemic, obviously top of mind, and looking at ways to improve and make the processes certainly more transparent would be more than a step in the right direction.
Sure. Absolutely.
So, Andrew, let me wrap it up with this last couple of questions. The legislative agenda, what's next for Congress? What do you see happening, obviously, in Washington and beyond? And what are your thoughts with respect to the future of policy in the country?
Yeah, two big questions. But I think we are on the legislative landscape question. We're seeing the start of federal appropriations season this year. And so all focus is on funding of federal health agencies, particularly with some of the new requirements that Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, CMS, are having to enter into, the big questions about how they are going to be funded in upcoming years. Another big thing that we're seeing legislatively is that President Biden's new Federal Health Research Program, ARPA-H, is just getting off the ground. They've hired a director and a team to start to build out the infrastructure for this entity. If you recall, this is the program that developed out of his cancer moonshot that was designed to be an independent, standalone entity separate from the NIH to really do some of the most advanced research, advanced clinical research out there. So that's an exciting possibility to see where ARPA-H goes over the next year. It will require likely some congressional oversight as it develops. So we will see conversations about that. You're also going to see a lot of hearings from committees like the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the Senate Health Committee, asking questions about, is the FDA and CDC equipped for the next potential pandemic that will come hopefully a long time from now, and hopefully we will be well prepared for when that time comes. But I think there is a lot of anxiety surrounding those agencies' responses and a lot of questions that will be asked over the next year. Do I see a large healthcare legislative vehicle? Probably not. We'll see some things through appropriations go through. We might see some new things through executive order coming from the White House regarding ARPA-H. We will likely see some discussions about healthcare as it relates to data privacy as that debate continues. All those things in a very busy congressional year.
Are you feeling good about the leadership in those committees?
I think we certainly see some strong new leaders on both sides of the aisle. I think it's a challenge in this Congress, however, to manage with such tight margins for both parties, both the majority and the minority. So while you have some key subject matter experts on some of the key healthcare committees down the roster, it's still going to be difficult if you're the Republican majority to move anything across the finish line because you have such little wiggle room, without, doing it in a bipartisan fashion. And we just don't see as many bipartisan, large-scale healthcare bills moving these days. And so that's, I think, one of the great challenges. But you've still got, a lot of members who are experts in public health. I think that surprises many members of the public who hear some of the loudest voices on CNN or Fox News, but there are still members of Congress out there who do their homework, who want to get it right, who want to support our federal agencies.
Fascinating. Andrew, we could go on all day on this topic. There's so much more to come. And I think as we get closer to 2024, we are definitely going to get back together and look at what's on let's just say the political agenda as election season starts to mature.
Well, that's right. A presidential campaign certainly shakes up the healthcare agenda too.
Right. Absolutely. With that, thank you, my friend. It's been an absolute pleasure and so happy to have you on the podcast and look forward to having you back again.
All right. Thanks so much, Rick.
Take care.